Philanthropy for Women, and we will be talking on Tuesday about the evolving AIDS and HIV situation. We've seen that particular infectious condition go through various stages over the last 4 decades. Fascinating discussion, and has a real impact on the COVID discussion, because if it were not for the work that has gone on for COVID, we might never get to a solution on AIDS. So let's get the show on the road. Thank you so much, and please contribute questions during the show. Welcome to the Nonprofit Report, your weekly update on nonprofit organizations, issues, and leaders. I'm your host, Mark Oppenheim, and today we will discuss the importance of women's foundations and their dedication to improving the lives of women with special guests. Felicia Davis, President and CEO of the Chicago Foundation for Women. Mary Rutherford, President and CEO of the Montana Community Foundation, and Elizabeth Barajas-Roman, President and CEO of the Women's Funding Network. And a reminder to Zoom attendees that we will take 3 snap polls during the show. We'll announce results, and questions submitted through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen will be included in our discussion. So thank you all for joining. It's wonderful to have you here. I must observe, as a man in the minority here, women comprise over 50% of Americans, so women are not a minority numerically. But let's talk frankly about why it's so important to have foundations that are dedicated to philanthropic causes that advance the interests of women. Felicia, could you start us off on your views and the views of your donors and grantees across Greater Chicago?
Absolutely. Thank you for having me, Mark. And it's a pleasure to be on this panel with Elizabeth and Mary. And Chicago, well, generally, Chicago Foundation for Women was founded in 1985. And at that time, there was a paltry amount of money in organized philanthropy being dedicated specifically to women and girls. And that hasn't changed in 35 plus years. Today, about 1.7% of all the money that is given in organized philanthropy is specifically dedicated to women and girls. And it looks different when we start to look at the intersectional identities that women and girls have. So Black women and girls, for example, Latina women and girls, Indigenous women and girls, the numbers continue to go down from there. So it hasn't really been a priority. But now, I think over 35 years with the work that's been done by not just women's foundations, the Women's Funding Network and others, there's an awakening and an acknowledgement. And in this moment, this big moment that we have with COVID, there's a huge opportunity and opening for everyone to really understand how seminal women and girls are to our society, and truly how seminal they are to the work that nonprofits do every day. And so the work that's being done in our communities every single day.
I think it's also important to consider how society, power, and wealth are tilted. They're tilted in particular ways. We of course have become far more aware of the tilt based in race, right? But there's also been a tilt based in gender. If you look historically, women couldn't own property for the longest time, and the philanthropists were men, and the people who were on boards were men, and the people who were making the decisions were men. Yet you take a look at this sort of 50% of the population that are women, and it just is insane that we are not engaging women, right, Mary? I mean, in terms of how we function as a society, we should be taking 100% advantage of every person that we have in America.
Absolutely. And at the Montana Community Foundation, well, Mark, I do want to say thanks for inviting us to this panel, and it's great to be with this incredible group of women. It is crazy that women really haven't been as represented in the boardroom, in the legislature, even in the upper and middle management of many organizations. And so part of the work that we've done over the years is really working, frankly, with some of the women who are graduating from college to help them understand how they can advocate for themselves, both from salary negotiations to getting onto boards to being involved. And also reminding the men that these are your daughters, these are your granddaughters, these are your sisters, and no good idea comes from one single person. And your bottom line is going to be so much better when you're a far more inclusive organization. So those are some of the things that we've worked on.
Also, assumptions get challenged, right? When you become more inclusive, assumptions get challenged. When assumptions are challenged, you get better decisions. Elizabeth, you have a very interesting role here because you are basically a network of funders. So how does your network, and you've been around for quite a while, how does your network see this issue? And in particular, how do you address a systemic change, not just points of philanthropy, but using philanthropy to actually shift this imbalance so that a woman's funding network becomes less critical because the imbalance has been addressed?
Thank you so much. And again, thank you so much for having us here today. And that's a really great question. So the Women's Funding Network is the largest alliance of women's funds and gender justice funders in the world. So we're a global network of organizations that focus on women and girls and gender justice and gender equality. And why that's important is that what's important to remember about women's funds and many gender justice funders around the world is that they're hyper local. They work within their communities, they work within their states to address the immediate and long-term needs of women and girls, but also specifically how gender plays a role in the economic recovery, in the economic security and safety of all families. So, with that very hyper-local role, it makes them really effective, it makes them really quick, but it also can be kind of isolating. So one of the things that Women's Funding Network does is really combine the power of all that local knowledge into a global network so that ideas are kind of cross-pollinated, so that we can move together on policy in certain areas. Like in the US, we have our largest number of members are in the US. So women's funds here in the US are working together to shape policy on gender here in the United States. And that looks like, and why that's important, because women's funds at the local level can talk about what's working. They're not just kind of picking policy out of the air. They're saying, this worked in Arizona, this worked in Chicago, this worked in, Montana. And when they're able to bring that up to the federal level and to Congress, it means something. It's not, again, it means something about what the appetite is for certain types of policy change. And it means that there's a built-in network to support that policy change at that federal level. So, again, the organizing of what women's fund and gender justice funders do, yes, they move money. Yes, it's about philanthropy, but it's also, number one, it's about advocacy. What you heard Felicia say, Mary say, is that there wasn't a place in the type of traditional philanthropy for women's voices and women's voices to center the things that are most important for them. And that's where women's funds really came together and started in their local communities. And so that's why the Women's Funding Network brings that together. But again, it's really just also lifting up the importance of those voices and the local solutions that they fund and also advocate for.
I'd like to hear your thoughts, the thoughts of everyone on this conference, on the juxtaposition between traditional values, traditional roles that every community has, and it doesn't matter if it's internationally defined or ethnically defined or religiously defined, right? There are traditional roles that split along gender lines, and there is sometimes a feeling of threat of changing those roles. We've seen this unfold through history in the United States and elsewhere in the struggles that women and girls face. Very often with this idea of suppressing educational opportunity or work opportunity or equal salary or whatever. Felicia, how do you see that unfolding, and how can your philanthropy create a greater understanding so that there isn't this oppositional nature to the advances that women need to undertake, and there's more support on both sides of the gender divide?
Mark, that's a really great question. I mean, as we do this work of really challenging these assumptions, the status quo, as we do the work of challenging what gender norms mean, and that women stay home and cook and clean, men go to work, little boys play with fire trucks, and little girls play with dolls, and girls wear pink, and all of these things are false constructs. But how that got translated is then in educational pursuits, women were, dumbed down, their aspirations were tampered down, and they weren't allowed to really express the fullness of their
Women can't do math, right?
Right. Can't do math, or, you're an artist, or those things. And so because of that, then the world of work mimics that, which then limits the opportunities that women have. But also, to a lesser extent, limits the opportunities that, men would have, right? Because if we really play to individual strengths and individual capabilities, this world looks a lot different. Because you talked about this earlier, right? Women are about 51% of the population. So you're telling me that women aren't as equally talented to be the scientists and doctors, bankers and lawyers, and that the C-suite,
inventors, engineers, military leaders, government leaders.
Absolutely. So, and so for us, and I think Mary and Elizabeth share this as well. Part of what we do, the advocacy piece, is so incredibly important to lift up those stories and use our dollars. I always say I'm an underdog, and I'm pushing the status quo for other underdogs. Like, people count you out. I'm intersectional. I have an intersectional identity of woman and being Black. And so the dollars that we activate are to help every other girl in this city see herself in any suite that she wants to be in, that she can see herself at the seat of power, that a little girl like me from the South Side of Chicago could see. The little girl like me from the South Side of Chicago could be the First Lady of the United States, could be President of the United States, right? That Kamala, that our Vice President with her intersectional identity. And also, I'm going to touch on ageism a little bit, that at 54, arguably is at the highest level of her power. And at 54, most of us are being pushed out of the workforce.
Well, obviously, Dame Judi Dench can't act, right? Because she's too old, right? Mary, you're still on mute, but I'm going to ask you. So, if you look at Felicia's point, right, and you look at our great diverse America of rural areas and urban areas, and Black and white and Native and diverse Asian, diverse Latino ethnicities, and all these other groups, right? It's pretty obvious that Felicia's experience in Chicago is very similar to someone's experience in rural Montana, right?
Absolutely. One of the things that Montana, we don't have a extremely diverse ethnic population. About 7% of our population are Indigenous people, and 92% are white. But what we see is this stark disparity between those ethnicities. And, Montana has this unfortunate reality of missing and murdered Indigenous women. And that's something that we have really started to get more involved in, and started funding, frankly, family searches, because there are all these questions about who has authority, whose jurisdiction is involved if an Indigenous person who lives on a tribal land is found, comes missing in a city that is not tribal land. And so the disparities are stark. Women are already at an extreme economic disadvantage in Montana compared to men, but it's even more just horrible for our Indigenous sisters. And, it's a little disheartening, frankly. One of the battles that, I don't know if it's a battle, but one of the things that we're involved in to a smaller degree probably than some of the panelists is legislative activity. And when I was watching our legislature this year, our legislature meets every other year, we were working to advance an early childhood initiative. And one of our legislators on the floor stood up and said, well, I don't think women should be working. They should be staying home. They should be taking care of the house. They should be having babies. And frankly, at this day and age, 2021 was frankly pretty appalling to hear. And so we have a long road ahead of us in Montana.
Mary, doesn't that mirror the uproar over the president talking about care as infrastructure? And, let's be honest, this entire country came to a standstill because we could not provide care. When women had to leave the workforce, 5 million women are out of the workforce right now because of the pandemic. Many of them, the sole thing that is keeping them out of that workforce is ample care, the provision of being able to have childcare. So we're making choices, and and so I wanted to make that point that even the issues in Montana aren't that very different. We have a crisis of missing and murdered Black women and trans women in Chicago that we've had to do special grant making on. And so the invisibility of women, I think, is something that is consistent no matter where we are, geography. I think Elizabeth sees that too with the WFN and the work across the country and globally.
We just completed a poll, Elizabeth, in which we asked whether there is this imbalance. 100% of respondents said yes, there is an imbalance. So let's talk a little bit about how we address that, because if a state with 92% a white ethnic group, so European origin, 7% Native, which looks completely different from Chicago, which is an incredible melting pot, very diverse, and completely different from different areas of the United States, has the exact same problem. So we know this is not an ephemeral issue. We know this is a persistent one. And you all were nodding about the whole idea of infrastructure, including childcare. I just think that's really interesting. If you include women's voices in this debate, what kind of changes do you believe are required going forward in this country that will have the greatest impact on evening up the score, so that when we ask the question again, are women treated equally to men, instead of having 100% say no, that we have a much more even balance? Elizabeth, if you were going to pick one or two things that we should change in our society to even up that balance, what would you pick?
Well, I think that one of the key pieces here is really how we think about women's work, women in work and women's work. So it's not just that women are not working or whether or not they should work, but thinking about what it means to have women's work, whether it's unpaid work, looking after children and taking care of a home, or it's women's work like being teachers and caregivers and childcare workers. That's one of the things why it was so, why that big uproar, right? How is it infrastructure? Because there's something about the narrative around what is considered women's work that is undervalued. Is quite frankly undervalued, and because society thinks of women still largely thinks that women should be at home taking care of children, that the idea of childcare is a privilege, that it's something that if you are able to afford it, or if you're able to do that, it's a privilege and not something that's part of a core public good for our economy. One thing that sticks in my head is around, it wasn't very long ago, in the 70s, when women weren't allowed to open bank accounts on their own. So when we think about why this is still persisting in 2021, it's not just about the attitudes follow the policy. We have policies that were in place, not too long ago. It's just a simple act of owning a bank account with your name on it to have access to the money and where that money goes. Was a recent innovation. So the idea that we have a long way to go, we just got started. We've just gotten started. And so the idea around childcare as infrastructure and what needs to change, I think there's the attitudes, the piece around what does it take, what does it look like to value women at work and women's work? Because the idea that women can be anything, we've been hearing that, which is great. I want women to be engineers and astronauts, but I also want them to feel just as valued in the society and as important and essential, and in terms of the good job, if they were a teacher or a care worker, as if they were a construction worker. those jobs should be equally compensated because they're just as essential. That road that goes to the city is just as essential as having care workers and teachers in a city. So those should be equal good paying jobs. And until those two things are the same, we have work to do.
So Mark, I would just, if I might just jump in and say, absolutely, Elizabeth. And I think the only way that we're going to get there is when the people who are making the decisions are equally represented by both men and women sitting around that table. Because unless their voices are heard and expressed, that's what's going to be required to see those kinds of changes. The old adage, if you're not, if you're not around the table, you're on the menu, and that's the reality, like getting that voice equally heard.
It's really voting more women into office, you mean?
All tables, I think all decision-making tables, whether that's policymakers at the elected level, whether that's corporate executives, whether that's, school boards or any other kinds of entity where decisions are made and things are discussed, women need to be equally represented.
I have a
Mark,
question.
can I add, the other thing that I would add is the economic impact of this. So there are estimates that it's costing us $65 billion a year in economic activity because of COVID related job losses. That's 65 billion. So if you want to argue about the investment in care infrastructure, think about what the ROI is on all of us by having that economic activity and productivity return to the workforce. The other thing that I would say, we need sick leave for all working persons. We've already talked a lot about care, but I will say again, we need affordable, accessible childcare, and the infrastructure of childcare has to be supported. And I think Elizabeth touched on the pay parity as well. We need gender pay parity for same work. In our region here, if Chicago were world class in paying women equitably, and this was from the reports by leanin.org, it would be over $58 billion in GDP into our local economy here. So the other thing is that people think, oh, this is like all soft touch feely type of stuff. There's a real economic price for all of these things and for this inequity.
Well, it's interesting. You're making a judgment, a justice, as well as a economic argument. One of the things that I think is so very fascinating about this discussion is the practicality of creating action. If you take a look at the discussion right now surrounding infrastructure, when you're talking about building roads, there are real interest groups who are going to get that money. There are construction firms, there are logistics organizations, there are businesses that are moving their trucks across the country. There are, when we're talking about internet infrastructure, there are technology firms, they're going to get the money. When you're talking about childcare, there is no such economic interest of a scale to lobby for it. So when you look at the practicalities of getting legislation passed that includes childcare as infrastructure, which is a point that you've all made, that it is an essential part of infrastructure from your perspective, it's kind of difficult. How do you change that? How do you make that argument when there's no business lobby behind that kind of investment? Indeed, the business lobby would see it in their interest to, instead of investing that money in dispersed childcare that could go to anyone, to instead have that money go into more roads, more physical infrastructure that could go to them. How do you deal with that in raw tactical terms, Felicia?
Well, I have to hold myself back from laughing. So because let's for a minute just assume we all think that having children being born into the United States is a good thing for the country, right? Like this, to grow our population, to have people. But yet we're saying, but somebody else needs to take care of those kids, and women, it should be you. This is, so to me, the lobby is all of us. The lobby is corporations. I mean, let's not forget that in childcare centers across this country, the commodities from the United States Department of Agriculture are like the #1 way that many of these children and these childcare centers across the that has, I don't know what that dollar value is. It's significant, I am sure, in milk and bread and fruit and all the things that children are eating when they're in school. Well, isn't that part of that lobby? And if I have a multinational company and I need a capable, talented, skilled workforce that is inclusive of the most diverse voices, well, wouldn't I be part of that lobby? And if I am government, wouldn't I be part of that lobby? So, and of course, you know, it should not just fall to the shoulders of women to be that lobby. So I laugh at that assertion a little bit because I mean, honestly, think about it. It's a little, I know this is the way it's been done, and I know that's the way people have felt for a long time, but we should laugh at ourselves for being so. Look at other countries. Other countries have figured this out. And there was an economist who said, you know, in other countries, when this pandemic hit globally, other countries had real infrastructure. United States had women.
You know, it's so interesting. What you're saying is that the statement surrounding the interests here, that businesses, the business lobby is interested in investments that flow to them. It's actually, what you're saying is if that's the analysis, it's a flawed analysis. Basically, you're saying if you invest in childcare, then the actual advantage disperses throughout the economy. Elizabeth, do your members see it that way as well in your network?
Absolutely, absolutely. That is absolutely part of the equation. The Women's Funding Network actually has a pilot project going on right now. It's a Women's Economic Mobility Project, and it's in 9 different states, 9 different locations. And these locations are piloting different aspects and different tactics to be able to increase the not only the economic security, but economic mobility and prosperity of women and their families. And when you look at some of the projects that they're doing, including, you know, Felicia in Chicago is doing, is one of the part of that community as well. It's a multi-pronged approach. They're not just looking at jobs. They're not just looking at school. They're looking at childcare, school, good jobs. They're looking at all of those things because it really does take all of that in order to increase the mobility of women and their families. And why even focus on that? Because it's, again, looking just at the raw data, we know from all around the world that the best investment in a society in terms of its economic mobility and security and the ability of that community to thrive is when you invest in women. And you invest in the women, it absolutely trickles down to increase the livelihood and stability of an entire community. So they've figured that out. When the U.S. does international development, that's how they put their money. They put their money in women and families. Why is the United States not doing what they would do in other countries here? You know, and I'm just knowing that that's exactly where the investment should lie. Yeah, so it's absolutely what our network is doing and focusing on multi-pronged approach, thinking about you know, all of the different aspects that women contribute to this. And I'll just go back to childcare just as a quick example. People think about childcare as a women's issue, but what's ironic is that what we've seen during this pandemic, when tables are formed to address the childcare issue, to talk about dollars that are coming into their community and how they should address it, our network is describing tables that are mostly male. These are mostly male tables that are talking about the infrastructure dollars that are coming into the community to partially address childcare. And oftentimes our members are the only women at the table talking about gender and talking about the gendered role of childcare, which is insane, right? You would think that absolutely you would bring women to the table, but it's just not happening, even in a childcare issue. So just to think about, you know, why it's so important to have women's funds at the table, in particular, because they do bring that advocacy and that philanthropy, but just advocates at the table that are going to center gender. And it's not just about talking about the women's issue, it's about centering gender and its critical role that it plays in addressing these issues. So yeah, definitely on board with that.
Well, we're coming to the end of our time. We're going to give Mary the last word, but to set you up, Mary, on one of our polls, we asked, has gender equality advanced since 2010? And the consensus answer seems to be yes, unevenly, but unevenly and not enough. And then we set the next question up with that one, which was what will have the biggest long-term productive impact on advancing the interests of women? And it was interesting. We got a whole range of different answers. The biggest answer was 65% was education that integrates gender equality teachings. And then also it was basically getting civil society groups, religious, civil society, business, and other groups behind gender equality. You know, those seem to be the biggest change drivers. Mary, what is your admonition to us all, men and women, people across different races, communities, regions, across rural and urban communities? What is your admonition to us all in terms of trying to change this situation so that the country becomes stronger?
Wow. Way to throw me a really tough one there at the end. I would say, you know, we're all in this together. And if I'm a man or if I'm a woman, I care about my community. I care about the future of my community. I care about my neighbor. We like to say in Montana, you know, it's one big state with just one road and a few stoplights. You have 1 million people. We're the 4th largest state. And we like to say that neighbor is a verb here. And we work really hard to try to be good neighbors. And being a good neighbor means standing at the fence and listening to each other and listening deeply and trying to walk in someone else's shoes to at least understand maybe what other people are dealing with. And my admonition for all of us is to be better listeners and open up to possibilities and think about what could be. Because if we can think about what could be, I'm sure we can all figure out a way to make it happen. So
just as true in Chicago, right, Felicia?
Absolutely. Mary, very well put. Thank you so much.
And Elizabeth, across the United States and the world, just as true for us all, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Love it. Thank you, Mary. That's great.
Felicia Davis, President and CEO of the Chicago Foundation for Women. Mary Rutherford, President and CEO of the Montana Community Foundation. Elizabeth Barajas-Roman, President and CEO of the Women's Funding Network. Thank you so much for helping us to understand this really important issue. Thank you for your insights. Thank you for the work of your staff, your constituents, your boards, and thank you all attendees for contributing, for spending time with us. And we'll see you on Tuesday to talk about AIDS in America, another virus that actually where the work on COVID promises some advances. So thank you all, and thank you all for sharing. Really, this has been a fantastic discussion.